Unidentified flying objects seemed to be everywhere in Virginia back in late 1964 and early 1965. Many different people would make reports, with these ranging from lights in the sky to aliens walking around an archery range. But these incidents all seemed to start after one man, a Mr. Burns, had a close encounter with a very bizarre-looking flying craft just 4 days before Christmas. After hearing of this encounter, a college professor went out to search the site for traces of radiation and found a large amount of it. Then, after receiving a letter from this professor, even Project Blue Book would get involved, sending 2 of their top agents out to investigate. December 21st, in 1964, a 54-year-old man, Horace Burns, was at a hardware store in Staunton, Virginia, buying supplies for the gun shop he owned back in Harrisonburg. At about 4:30, he finished his shopping, soon leaving the city, heading east on US Route 250 towards his home in Grottoes. He drove his 1958 Mercury station wagon for about 30 minutes and was now about 8 miles outside of Staunton, around Shenandoah Valley. This is when he would notice a huge dark object floating in from the north. It was so large that he couldn't even see the entire thing while looking through his windshield. This strange object, moving around 15 miles an hour, then crossed the road in front of him, and as it did so, it seemed that, quote, some sort of force was exerted on the car because of the way it slowed down, Burns later said. His car came to a stop unusually fast, and when Burns went to restart it, the engine wouldn't turn over, almost like the car had run out of gas. The giant UFO slowed down before coming to a rest in a meadow about 100 yards away from him on the side of the highway. It landed so gently, Burns thought it looked like a bubble falling to the ground. He maneuvered his car to the side of the road and got out to get a better look. All he could do was stare in amazement at this bizarre sight. It was a kind of cone shape, but not quite. Its sloping sides rose in 6 ring-like segments that each decreased in diameter. The very top looked to be kind of a dome shape. The bottom of the object slightly curved and also seemed to have a band about a foot wide emanating a weird whitish blue light. This UFO was around 125 feet in diameter and about 80 to 90 feet tall. To Burns, it almost looked like a, quote, old-fashioned beehive from comics and cartoons. It was now past 5 p.m. and it was starting to get a bit dark out. Because of this, he wasn't quite sure what color it was or what it was constructed of, but to him the whole thing had the look of spun aluminum. He saw no windows, doors, or even seams on this craft. He also looked for landing gear, but didn't see any of that either. It looked to just be resting directly on the ground. Burns would say, I stood beside the car for perhaps 1.5 minutes before it rose up and took off. But when it went real fast. It took off at a perfectly square angle, and it only made a soft whooshing sound before flying off in the northeasterly direction. He got back in his car and was now surprised to see that it started up right away. Burns started to head back home, but he was still in such a state of shock he would hardly even remember the drive. He almost immediately told his wife of the encounter, but he didn't plan on telling anyone else, telling her they'd think I'm crazy. But this would soon change, as just 6 days later, by coincidence, they would hear of a new UFO investigators club formed the Eastern Mennonite College. Miss Burns would then convince Horace to contact them and share what he had witnessed. And he did just that, giving them a call about 1 week after his encounter. Ernest Gaiman, a professor of German, was the head of this club, and their goal was to investigate known sightings of unidentified flying objects in the area and record these events. After hearing of Mr. Burns' sighting, he decided to go out to his gun shop and record his story on tape. Gaiman wanted Burns to take him out to the area. Knowing of other UFO cases, he thought he could use his Geiger counter to look for unusual radiation. But unfortunately, Burns was waiting for a customer to come pick up a big order and couldn't leave for quite a while. So he told Gaiman where to go, giving him a description of the meadow and telling him it was just a quarter-mile away from the Woodrow Wilson Rehabilitation Center in Augusta County. Gaiman, driving down the highway, soon found the meadow with little difficulty. He started to walk around the area, and just where Mr. Burns had described, about 100 yards away from the road, the Geiger counter needle started to rise. It showed a radioactivity of over 60,000 counts per minute. Walking a bit further, the needle started to swing off the dial. He would try to adjust the counter to get it to read higher amounts, but it would still occasionally swing off again. He started to use the probe attachment to test the grass, and would find the same thing. In most spots, it was the same 60,000 counts per minute. but some certain areas of grass were so radioactive that he actually couldn't accurately measure it. Gaiman said that he would also have to leave the area and wipe off the probe after these high readings, as the particles would just get stuck to it. When he was about halfway through probing the area, he was surprised to see 2 other cars pulling up to the side of the nearby highway. 2 men would get out, walking over and striking up a conversation with him. Harry Cook, a Dew Point research engineer, and one of his co-workers, a man known as Mr. Funk, had actually heard of Mr. Burns' encounter the day before through a word of mouth around the town. They already knew this was the meadow he was talking about and actually drove past it most nights on their way home from work. When they saw Professor Gaiman out there, they decided to stop and see what he was up to, just out of curiosity. Gaiman was mostly just happy to have other people there to corroborate his findings with the Geiger counter. The needle was hovering around 16 to 18 milliroentgens per hour, and the rays seemed to be hitting the probe tube from a wide area. Gaiman thought this because every time he called the men over to take a look at the needle, the readings would decrease. Their bodies were shielding the probe from some of the rays, meaning that it must be mostly comprised of alpha and beta radiation. Alpha and beta radiation can't typically move through thicker objects. Gaiman says that if it was gamma radiation, then the counter dial wouldn't have moved when they all stepped in front of it. Cook would later tell the local newspapers, "It was a hot area. We spent 45 minutes in the field trying to tone this reading down. We checked the radium dial on our watches, even went over a small hill from the field, but this was definitely an accurate reading. The only thing I can say is that it was hot." Gaiman would comment that he could even trace the outline of the UFO through the radiation readings, saying, "I know the area was fully as large as Mr. Burns described it." Gaiman was so amazed by these results that the very next day he would invite Mr. Burns to come down to the college and tell his encounter during a UFO Investigator Club meeting. And he agreed to this, drawing quite the audience later that night, too, with between 250 and 400 people showing up to listen to his strange encounter. It was then that Professor Gaiman decided to write a letter to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base's Project Blue Book, giving them a brief description on Mr. Burns' encounter and the results he found in the meadow. On January 12, 1965, 22 days after the sighting and 12 days after the letter, Project Blue Book would send out Sergeant Moody and Agent Harold Jones to investigate. They pretty quickly got a hold of Gaiman and Burns, and they all got lunch together before heading out to the site. Reporters would also show up at the landing area, with Sergeant Moody being interviewed several different times. He would first comment, "This is an unusual sighting. It's not routine. If it was routine, we wouldn't be here." The total of now 6 people walked into the field, with Mr. Burns leading the way. There was now 4 inches of snow on the ground, but that didn't slow Burns down. Gaiman later said, "It was no little gratification to me to see Mr. Burns lead the group to exactly the area that Mr. Cook, Mr. Funk, and I found to be radioactive, and hear him say, 'Here, gentlemen, is where this thing stood.'" They would continue to walk around for about 30 more minutes, with Moody apparently taking between 20 and 30 samples with his Geiger counter. Each time, they only scraped away a bit of the snow with their foot before performing another test. Gaiman was sure he saw the needle rising a few times, but each time Moody would make adjustments to the Geiger counter. Gaiman later wrote, "Twice when the needle started to rise, he ejaculated, quickly made some adjustment on his survey meter which caused the needle to return to 0, and then said, 'See, there's no radiation here.'" By the end, Moody and Jones would conclude that there were no unusual radiation levels in the meadow, but they did say that if there was any radiation, it's possible that it already dissipated, which if that was the case, they could already rule out certain types of radiation. They started to question Burns a little bit more, asking him for details that they may have missed before. Sergeant Moody and Jones would agree to rule out the possibility of a helicopter or plane, as it really just didn't fit the description. They said that they knew it didn't conform with any known aircraft. Moody had 4 years of experience in investigating sightings like this, but he had never heard of a UFO of this shape before. He said that he could not find answers because Project Blue Book had, quote, "0 reports like this." They also wanted to find some more witnesses, if possible. They asked Mr. Burns if he had seen any other cars driving down the road during this encounter. Unfortunately, though, he hadn't seen anything. Even if any did pass by, he didn't think he would notice because all of his attention was on this strange landed craft. He said that he just wasn't looking for cars right then. And Burns seemed to be calm and relaxed during this interview and just appeared to be a pretty normal person. Moody would also write in his report that Burns exhibited no indications of suffering from mental disorders. Over the next couple days, they would question him multiple times, but his story always remained the same. After this, Moody determined that Burns did indeed seem like a credible man. They would finish their basic report, sending it back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And although it would be some time before the public got to see these, they did make a few copies for some of the people involved. In the end, the two claimed to have never found any more witnesses. They felt that an object 125 feet in diameter and 80 to 90 feet high would have definitely been seen by other people. They would also comment that there were no depressions and no other indication that anything had even landed in the meadow to begin with. They said that the brittle grass hadn't even been flattened down, something they would expect to see. Mr. Burns was then asked by a journalist if this report helped explain his encounter, with him replying, "Frankly, they told me very little. I gathered the impression that they didn't have anything to tell me." The next Sunday, Jones didn't have much to do and decided to give both Gaiman and Burns another call, just to see if their stories would remain the same. He purposely tried to trip Burns up with a few different facts, but each time he would be corrected. Jones also just kept asking him about seeing other cars, just not believing that no one was driving down Route 250 at 5 p.m. After all, he was under the impression that it was a pretty well-traveled road. In his official report about this phone call, Jones wrote, "I think we need a psychiatrist here. What does a person need to eat to see a traveling beehive?" He then also called Gaiman, and as Jones expected, he was a bit displeased with him after reading Moody's report. Gaiman also really just wanted to know why Moody kept messing with the Geiger counter after each large reading, and Jones didn't really seem to have an answer for this. Gaiman also brought up the two men that had visited him in the field while he was taking his readings, and asked why they hadn't interviewed them. Both Mr. Funk and Mr. Cook lived just a few miles away from the landing location. But according to Jones, it seems that they really just didn't want their names included in the report. So they were just never interviewed because Moody thought that anonymous testimony just wouldn't be worth much. The report and added phone calls would really frustrate both Gaiman and Burns, and they started to suspect some sort of cover-up. Gaiman decided to write to Wright-Patterson again, detailing everything that Moody got wrong in his report in a rather lengthy letter. Besides quite a few minor mistakes, Gaiman also had some comments and some questions on some of the major points in the report. He first questioned how they knew the grass hadn't shown any traces of a landing when it was covered in 4 inches of snow the day they were out there. Not only that, but the field had also been mowed for hay a couple of months back, something that they never even asked about. Gaiman was also curious on whether or not Moody was using the right kind of Geiger counter, as it seemed quite different than the one he borrowed from the college. He also told them that there were other witnesses, and he found one willing to give his name. And apparently they had heard of this witness too, and just failed to contact him, as the same reporter that interviewed them in the meadow that day had also interviewed this other witness. On December 21st at 4:50 p.m., just 10 minutes before Burns had his encounter, a high school student, Kenneth Norton Jr., would see something very similar from his bedroom window. To Kenneth, the object looked to be the shape of a large cigar, but he also commented that the angle was a little odd, so he thought it might look a little different up close. He immediately went and told his mother, who believed him, but wouldn't allow him to tell anyone else. But after a couple of weeks, she would hear about Mr. Burns' encounter, now thinking that her son's sighting might help verify the whole event. The mother said, "We wouldn't let him tell this until now because my husband holds a responsible position." Kenneth would then talk to the reporter mentioned earlier, drawing her a sketch of the object he had seen. He told her that it looked to be about 125 feet long and maybe 80 to 90 feet tall, which matched the dimensions Burns had given before exactly. He only saw it for about 5 seconds in total, and he was sure it was made of some kind of metal, also adding, "It didn't have any wings or tail structure. I don't think there's a plane that would go at such a tremendous speed." Wanting to find even more witnesses, Gaiman urged this reporter to look for and send him more people that had seen this flying object. Almost immediately, he would meet up with 3 more witnesses. He first heard from a research engineer that lived near the Waynesboro airport. He claimed that both him and his son saw a UFO flying overhead the same night Burns had his sighting. Then the next person would tell Gaiman that around 5 p.m. on the 21st, the same time that Burns had his encounter, a number of homeowners would call into the Virginia Electric and Power Company, all complaining of similar issues. Their lights were dimming on and off, and their radios and TVs weren't working. Apparently this only lasted for a few minutes before power returned back to normal. Soon, new encounters were being reported in the area at an alarming rate. Within just a few weeks, over 30 more sightings had been made in Augusta County alone. This all grabbed the attention of the director of the National Investigating Committee on Aerial Phenomena, Richard Hall. He claimed that UFO sightings in the whole country were becoming more numerous, even telling of an incident in Washington, D.C. Hall would say that on December 29th, just a week after Burns' sighting, an object roughly the same size, moving 4,800 miles an hour, was caught on radar flying over the Capitol. He also commented that even though Sergeant Moody hadn't heard of a UFO in this shape before, it was actually a pretty common description. Hall also felt like the radiation samples had been taken much too late, commenting that the area has to be gone over quickly because most of the time the radiation dissipates quite quickly. He even thought that Project Blue Book wasn't giving them all the details, saying, "The Air Force and other services don't say any more than they have to." So Hall decided to contact the Air Force himself to see if he can get any more information out of them. A spokesperson for Project Blue Book would tell him in a phone interview that they had actually received 2 more possibly related reports. And this was in the same area, they just hadn't mentioned it publicly yet. One would come from Williamsburg, where 2 separate motorists driving on the same road would make an unusual sighting. About 5 miles outside of town, they would both see a tall object flying through the sky, which looked to be made of a shiny aluminum material. Then in Bedford, just 3 days later, one couple would report seeing an object in the sky that looked to be either cigar or disc-shaped. Just 15 minutes later, and 15 miles away, another man would make a report saying that he saw some kind of square shape hovering in the sky. Not satisfied with just these 2 sightings, Hall decided to look into the area more to see if he could find any reports himself, and he quickly found another man with a strange sighting living out in Waynesboro. He would go and interview a man named William Blackburn, who not only saw a UFO, but the occupants of it as well. On January 19th, around 5:40 p.m., Blackburn was out working, chopping trees for the Augusta County Archery Club off of Route 250. He was close to finishing up for the day, with it already starting to get quite dark out. This is when he suddenly saw 2 strange shiny silver objects appear in the sky. They looked to be about the same basic shape, but one was much larger than the other. The smaller of the 2 then started to descend towards the ground, landing less than 20 yards away from him. Blackbird then saw 3 extremely odd-looking beings about 3 feet tall exit the craft. They were all dressed alike, wearing uniforms the same color as the ship, looking to be made of a shiny metallic material. They were roughly human-shaped, and to him they didn't appear hostile. He also noticed that each one of them seemed to have a very long finger on just one hand. The eyes felt especially penetrating, with Blackburn saying, "They seem to look through you." The 3 creatures started to walk towards him, coming to within just 12 yards of where he was standing. Frozen in fear, Blackburn clutched his axe tightly and stood there watching them. The strange beings began to communicate with each other, making strange sounds that Blackburn couldn't even recognize as language. They then turned around and climbed back in their craft. The door closed behind them before looking to mold into the ship itself, leaving no outlines. The smaller ship then flew back in the sky where it met up with the larger craft, and they both just soon took off and disappeared. He then went on to tell his encounter to the local media, ending his interview by saying, "I am sure I did not have a hallucination. I didn't used to believe in these things. This made me a believer." Soon after this story was released, Blackburn claims to have been visited by government agents who wouldn't identify themselves. Then, in a somewhat threatening way, told him that he needed to stop talking about his encounter. Hall would investigate this claim as well, and later shared his finding on a radio interview.
And he stated that he was very frightened by the experience. Now, I hasten to add that we don't necessarily believe this story 100%. We're interested in objective scientific investigation, and that's why we were there. But one point I would like to make is that this man very obviously had been intimidated by some kind of government agents, unidentified. We don't know who they were, Air Force, FBI, CIA. But it was very obvious from talking to this man's friends, who are very responsible local citizens, that this man had been intimidated and could not talk about his experience.
There were quite a few other sightings in the area too. Hall would also hear that around this time, a family of 6 witnessed a cigar-shaped craft flying in the sky for several minutes near Staunton High School. Another woman living in the same town would also report a brightly lit object in the sky that seemed to follow her home while walking one night. On January 20th, near Dooms, 2 teenage boys would also report a strange blue and green object moving quickly across the sky. The next day, a woman living in Fishersville told News Virginia that she and her son had watched a, quote, shapeless, noiseless object in the sky over Waynesboro for 90 minutes. Then on the 23rd at 8:40 a.m., Mr. Maines, a man living in Williamsburg, witnessed a mushroom or light bulb-shaped craft flying just 4 feet above the ground near the side of the road. It appeared to be 80 feet tall, 20 feet wide on top, and 10 feet across at the bottom. It was a metallic gray color, with the bottom emanating a red-orange light on one side and a bluish light on the other. As it passed next to him, his car's electronics started to behave strangely, and all he could hear is the sound of air rushing, similar to a vacuum cleaner. But then, after only 25 seconds, it flew off extremely quickly. The next day, a couple in Verona watched a bright yellow light hovering near their home for several minutes. It then shot off in the direction of Staunton. The next night, several more reports would come in from Fredericksburg. Several different people were talking of a top-shaped object shooting sparks as it rose up into the air. Then, just a couple hours later, around 11 p.m., a witness living outside of Bedford reported seeing an aluminum-colored object moving across the sky at a fairly slow pace. Then, just 5 minutes later, a couple from Monetta would call in, telling of a cigar-shaped craft moving in the sky overhead. Shortly after this, it seems that a man from Augusta County named Donald Cash was seen running around dressed like a spaceman in an attempt to spoof reporters. Unfortunately for him, one night his little prank nearly backfired when 3 teens tried to chase him down and beat him up. Then, on January 28th, some of the residents living near Route 250 in Augusta County decided that the local police weren't doing enough to protect him from the strange objects. They all grabbed their guns and began to march down the highway looking for aliens. The local sheriff, John Kent, said, "This has gotten completely out of hand," and then added that if it happened again, he would be forced to make some arrests. A couple days later, on the 30th, near Newport, at about 8:30 p.m., 5 high school students reported seeing a triangle or pyramid-shaped UFO flying above them. On the top and right side of the craft, there were bright white lights, while on the bottom left side, there was an orange light. It was flying to the south to start with, but then suddenly it turned to the northwest and disappeared very quickly into the distance. In total, they watched it flying overhead for nearly 20 minutes, with no sound ever being heard. Now, while all these other sightings were happening, Sergeant Moody and Agent Jones were actually still in the area. They were trying to keep a low profile while investigating Mr. Burns' case and all the other sightings coming in, but it just seemed like it was impossible at this point. Reporters always seemed to know where they were at, and they continually bugged them with the same questions over and over again. Moody apparently started to just tell them all the same thing, saying that yes, this case was indeed unusual, but he assured everyone that there was absolutely nothing to fear. With questions constantly being asked and new cases being reported almost daily, Moody decided to write back to Wright-Patterson again, requesting more agents for help. This is when something sort of weird would happen. Major Cantonilla, the director of Project Blue Book, would write back to him saying that not only were they not sending more agents, but they also needed Moody and Jones to return back to the airbase. Cantonilla mentioned that there was an incident in Ohio between an Air Force fighter plane and an unidentified flying object, and he needed Moody back immediately. However, there were never any records of this incident to be found. This led many of the locals to think that this was just an excuse made up by them to stop investigating Burns' encounter. Moody and Jones soon returned, and Blue Book was said to have sent out another agent who would stay there until summertime looking further into the sightings. But nothing new would ever come from this. In total, Project Blue Book would record nearly 50 sightings in this area of Virginia alone. By February, the wave of UFO sightings had started to die down, with fewer and fewer encounters being reported. Then in March, Project Blue Book would quietly release their report of the Fishersville case to the general public. In short, they said that they found no evidence to support a UFO landing and actually suggested that Burns might need to have his mental health evaluated. But then in contrast to this, Moody also wrote in this report that, quote, "Burns' reliability as a witness is not questioned." He also said that they could rule out planes and helicopters landing in the meadows, and he was positive that it wasn't a prank or hoax. But other than that, they didn't offer any other explanations. Moody later said that he personally didn't have any theories on it all either, saying, "I wish I did. It would certainly ease Mr. Burns." With hardly anything coming from the investigation, many local residents remained skeptical. They would attempt to poke holes in Burns' story while also calling him crazy or a nut on many different occasions. But he also gained believers from this, with many others now believing in UFOs only because of his encounter. In the end, Mr. Burns would say, "I am not looking for notoriety or publicity or anything like that. I was astonished looking at the thing." Thanks again for watching, everyone. Please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content. And be sure to leave a comment too. I'm always curious on how I'm doing with these, and I always want to know your thoughts on these topics as well. I was originally just trying to find an encounter that happened around Christmas, but I ended up finding one that happened around Christmas and happened almost exactly 60 years ago. I honestly thought it was pretty interesting, so I hope you all thought it was too. And before I go, I should also mention this is available in audio format as well, and that's on most podcast platforms. For any of you wanting to show your support, I've also opened up a Patreon and a channel membership where you can get videos early and ad-free. So be sure to check all that out if it sounds interesting. This was Matt, and I want to believe. And Merry Christmas, everyone.